An Introduction to Social Policy by Dr. Nick Wilmore. In this fourth part of the series of clips, I'm going to be looking at how we make social policy, with a particular focus on doing so within the UK. Okay, so you will have gathered from the last couple of slides that there is no fixed approach to how social policy is developed, how it changes, but that it is a combination of social and professional issues that result in a momentum that results in change. How that momentum happens is quite variable, and I think you will have also gathered that I have a view that it is influenced both by traditional and by new media, that it's about how society chooses to articulate its ideas, and that is currently in quite a degree of flux as a result of developing technologies and the way that we communicate with each other. There are, as I've also indicated, the potential for new initiatives to be disruptors, and I think Marcus Rashford's free meals initiative in 2020 is a great example of that. That here was somebody who has used his celebrity status as a footballer to engage in some very real issues on the social policy agenda, about economic exclusion, about opportunity for those who are experiencing, let's bluntly call it, poverty, because we may well be in an incredibly wealthy country, but there are still some that experience very real effects of poverty. The key thing in amongst all of this, of course, is that people and ideas are brought together in a political dialogue, and I make no bones about it, we are talking now about political ideas, about political ideologies, and that then influences the way that people are heard. If your value base is about actually individuals have a responsibility for themselves and that the state should be kept to a minimum, you're going to have a very different concept of who funds your residential care compared to somebody who believes that actually, as a society, we have a responsibility for those who are least able, and that society is the best way of sharing the costs and responsibilities so that no one person is significantly affected by particular changes in their lives. So social policy has some very different drivers about who calls for change, who hears it, and therefore how does social policy change to respond. So I'm now going to start looking at some of the approaches to how we change, and with that, of course, in mind, how we change social policy. When I'm looking at the mechanics of change around social policy, it's probably worth just having a quick reflection back on the discussion so far. That when we're looking at what might be considered a social pressure that generates change in policy, I've already mentioned we could look towards ideas being generated and disseminated by a particular group, and I mentioned the development of personalisation was very much a reaction to the disabled people's movements, but equally the development of the Children Act in 1989, if you can remember that far back, was the result of lobbying by not only groups representing children but also groups representing parents. That You also have implementation of policy by a specific political group, and usually when we talk about that, we're talking about the political grouping that is responsible for the leadership of a particular government or government body. And let's not forget how local government can be just as important when we're talking about implementation of policy. Occasionally we may have lessons learned from reviews, whether that be serious case reviews, whether it be public inquiries or royal commissions. They're bringing together a range of experiences, typically of professional groups, but not always. And I'm very aware that we're hearing already quite a lot about the impact of housing management over the years had a detrimental effect on Grenfell Tower and how that building was managed, and that's clearly going to result in changes in legislation and expectations of social housing. You also talk about individual and group experiences being reported, and in today's media, particularly social media, you very quickly hear about individual experiences, and they then are able to quickly form a group around them of people that are validating that experience, which results in a need for change. Whether that be, we've heard about the impact of bullying and the lack of care of young people on social media, and the expectation in society that something is done about it, which will ultimately mean some form of legislation, either in terms of primary legislation or more likely some sort of statutory instrument. But equally, in the 90s and noughties, we heard quite a lot about pensions and a few people's experiences then being extrapolated into some major changes in pension provision. But you also get, at times, and I call it uncoordinated calls, because actually what you're talking about is a number of voices across society calling for change following some sort of crisis or major trauma. And I think the recent response to the pandemic is an example of that, where different parties are calling for different approaches to policy based on personal views or science or ethical values that have an expectation of what is the right role of society. When I look at how change in social policy happens, I think it's one of those where we all know the different aspects of it. So we're all aware of practice models, we're all aware of NICE guidance, we're aware of legislation, we're aware of things like working together or the codes of practice. But I think it's worth actually just looking at it as a continuum that shows actually the number of different tools and levers there are within the social policy framework in the UK. And I'm unashamedly saying the UK here, because the concept of guidance, green papers, statutory guidance, white papers, and then legislation are all very much tied up in the UK framework. But the point that is international is that any form of social policy framework in your country will start at one level with practice models about how we operate, how we deliver services, what is considered good practice or notable practice, how we understand what has happened, what works well, what doesn't work well, which is where policy reviews come in. that we have at times set policy guidance where government is being much more prescriptive about what outcomes it wants professionals to deliver. And at times that can become professional guidance with some very specific responsibilities if ever you were to be challenged. Green papers are the government's way of setting out its overall approach. It's often light on detail, but very much trying to give a steer as to where the government believes specific service delivery should be going. Occasionally, this might influence statutory guidance, but green papers, technically, following consultation, should lead to a white paper, and white papers then set out changes to statutory guidance and legislation that the government intends to follow through. So the white paper is very much the final step before legislation. But occasionally you might see something going from a green paper jumping very quickly to legislation, as happened with the Care Act, because, for instance, the policy review looking at the legal aspect, a Royal Commission looking at adult care law, said a change needed to be made in order to bring the law up to date. So whilst I've set this out as a very neat continuum, it don't always happen that way. And this comes back to the mechanisms of change I talked about, where you may find several different voices coming together from different perspectives that advocate a common approach. And the result is a change in policy, a change in social direction. Okay, so in the current clips, what we've looked at is a definition of social policy, a very quick run through how social policy is created in terms of the voices coming together to articulate the way forward, and some of the mechanics that we would then use in order to change policy. The next clip after this is going to start looking at the implementation of social policy, which in some ways is a field of study almost in its own right. So I look forward to you joining me again in a minute. Thank you very much.